The library basement smelled of damp paper and dust. Daniel's footsteps echoed softly as he descended the cracked concrete stairs, each creak of the wooden railing reminding him that this place hadn't been renovated in decades. He wasn't even supposed to be here. Staff only had been scrawled across the locked door upstairs. But curiosity had always been Daniel's downfall. At 29, he'd already built a reputation as a stubborn, sometimes reckless journalist. He wasn't employed by any major outlet, but his online blog had a loyal following of readers who devoured his stories about abandoned buildings, unsolved mysteries, and forgotten histories. The more bizarre, the better. And when he'd stumbled upon a single passing mention of something called the Project buried in a half-burned newspaper clipping, he knew he had to dig deeper. The basement stretched out like a maze of shadows. Old metal filing cabinets leaned against each other like drunks after last call. Broken chairs, yellowing newspapers, and bound archives of the town's oldest records were stacked in haphazard piles. He switched on his phone's flashlight and scanned the room. At first, nothing stood out, just dust and decay. But then, in the far corner behind a toppled shelf, he noticed something strange. A steel cabinet, newer than everything else around it, its surface free from the layers of filth. A padlock sealed the handle shut. Daniel crouched, tugged the lock. It was rusted but firm. His pulse quickened. He slipped a pocket knife from his backpack, pried at the latch until the brittle metal finally snapped. The doors squealed open. Inside, neatly stacked folders sat waiting, each marked with bold red stamps. Classified. He swallowed hard. The first file was filled with pages so heavily redacted that only fragments remained. Psychological endurance tests. Containment breach. Subjects no longer stable. Relocation to Site 13. Daniel's mouth went dry. Government experiments? Here? In this quiet little town? He dug deeper. A second file contained grainy photographs, blurry corridors, shadowy figures strapped to chairs, medical staff in hazmat suits. And then at the bottom of the stack, a single photo that froze him cold. A man staring directly into the lens. The image was decades old, faded with time, but the eyes were sharp, locked onto whoever had been behind the camera. His expression was blank, as though caught mid-breath. Daniel's phone trembled in his hand as he brought the photo closer to the light. The face staring back at him wasn't a stranger. It was his own. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead bulb. Daniel's thoughts scattered like broken glass. It had to be a coincidence, someone with similar features, a trick of the light. But the longer he stared, the less room there was for doubt. The jawline, the slope of the nose, even a faint scar near the temple from when he'd fallen off his bike at 12 years old. The photograph was him. Only, it was dated 1973. He wasn't even born until 1994. Daniel shoved the photo back into the file, his breathing shallow. His instincts screamed to leave, but something heavier, darker, rooted him in place. He had come looking for a story, but this was more than that. This was a discovery that felt alive, as though the very walls were holding their breath around him. He grabbed as many folders as he could carry and stuffed them in his backpack. As he did, he noticed something etched into the back wall of the cabinet, carved deep into the metal with a shaky hand. "Stop digging." Daniel froze. The words weren't part of the original cabinet. They looked desperate, carved in haste. He switched off his flashlight, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was in the silent, sprawling basement. For a few seconds, he just listened, and that's when he heard it. A soft shuffle. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the aisles of decaying archives, something was moving. He held his breath, ears straining. The sound was faint, but deliberate, the drag of a foot against concrete. Daniel tightened his grip on his backpack and slowly began edging back toward the stairwell. Another shuffle. Closer. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He didn't want to aim a flashlight. Some part of him knew he didn't want to see what was making that sound. But his instincts betrayed him. He flicked the beam across the basement. Nothing. Just dust and paper. And then, for the briefest moment, his light caught on something at the far end of the room. A figure, half hidden in the shadows. Still, watching. The phone slipped in his sweaty hand. The the light jerking away, plunging the room back into darkness. By the time he steadied it and swept the beam across again, the figure was gone. Daniel didn't remember climbing the stairs, only the sickening relief of bursting back into the dimly lit library lobby. The air felt fresher, his lungs no longer squeezed by the basement's suffocating weight. He hurried past the front desk, where the old librarian glanced up at him with a frown. "You weren't downstairs, were you?" she asked, her voice sharp. Daniel froze, clutching his backpack closer. "No. Why?" The librarian's eyes lingered on him a moment too long, searching, calculating. Then she gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Because that basement has been locked for years." Daniel's throat went dry. The padlock he'd broken, the files, the photo, the figure. Locked for years? He forced a shaky smile, muttered something about deadlines, and left. Outside, the night air chilled his skin, but the tightness in his chest didn't fade. He walked quickly to his car, trying to shake off the unease. But when he unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, he noticed something lying on the passenger side. Another photograph. The same one of him, the man staring into the camera, decades too early. Only this time, the photo looked sharper, clearer. And written across the bottom, in jagged handwriting, were two words that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Welcome back." Daniel barely slept that night. The photo he'd found on the passenger seat wouldn't leave his mind. Its handwritten words burned into his thoughts. "Welcome back." Who put it there? The librarian? The shadow he'd glimpsed in the basement? Or, worse, someone who had been following him far longer than he realized? By morning, his nerves buzzed like frayed wires. Coffee barely steadied his hands as he scrolled through the documents he'd stolen. The files mentioned something about Site 13, always paired with phrases like containment and non-disclosure. No location, no clear explanation, just fragments, like a puzzle missing its centerpiece. One detail stood out, the name of a town, Ashthorne, about 40 miles away. Daniel had never heard of it. It wasn't on any modern maps, but after hours of digging through forums and old government directories, he found a reference. Ashthorne, Pop. 2043, mining town, established 1871. That was all he needed. By early afternoon, he was on the road. The drive was uneventful at first. The highway stretched endlessly, flanked by skeletal trees whose branches clawed at the gray sky. But as he neared Ashthorne, his GPS grew erratic, rerouting him through narrow backroads that wound into a valley. Finally, the town revealed itself. Ashthorne was wrong. Too quiet. Rows of houses slumped in disrepair, paint peeling, windows clouded. The main street held a gas station, a shuttered barber shop, and a diner with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying fly. Maggie's. Daniel parked outside the diner. Inside, the place was half empty. A jukebox sat dead in the corner, and the smell of frying oil clung to the air. A few locals hunched over their meals, speaking in low tones. He slid into a booth. A waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Claire approached, pad in hand. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yeah, please." She poured without another word. Daniel studied her carefully. She looked mid-30s, but her eyes carried the weight of someone twice that. After a moment, he leaned in. "You ever hear of something called a project?" The effect was immediate. Her hand froze, coffee pot hovering midair. Then, slowly, she set it down and forced a smile. "Never heard of it," she said too quickly. But her eyes betrayed her. Daniel pushed. "What about Site 13? A spoon clattered at a nearby table. One of the locals, an older man with a cap pulled low over his face, rose abruptly and left without paying his bill. Claire glanced nervously at the door, then leaned closer, voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't say those words here. People are listening." Daniel frowned. "Who?" She hesitated, lips trembling. Then she scribbled something on the back of his receipt, slid it across the table, and walked away without another word. Daniel unfolded it under the table. 3 words scrawled in hurried ink. "You're being watched." The rest of the meal was a blur. Daniel paid in cash, left a tip, and slipped outside. The street was empty except for an old black van parked 2 blocks down. Its windows were tinted, engine idling softly. He froze. The moment he looked at it, the engine cut off. Silence. He forced himself to walk back to his car, keys clenched like a weapon. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. By the time he checked into a small roadside motel that evening, his nerves were frayed. The motel was the kind of place where the wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin and the bed sheets smelled faintly of mildew. But exhaustion won. He locked the door, drew the curtains tight, and tried to convince himself he was safe. Sleep came reluctantly. At 3:17 a.m., Daniel's eyes shot open. He didn't know why at first. Just a sharp jolt, as though something had yanked him out of a dream. His room was still, the air heavy and cold. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Inside his room. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard the lock turn. The door was still closed. He slid a trembling hand toward the nightstand, fumbling for his phone. The screen lit up the room with a cold glow. For a split second, he saw it. A shadow by the corner of the room, tall and still. And then the light died, his phone flickering off on its own. The footsteps resumed. Closer. His pulse pounded. He scrambled backward against the headboard, heart hammering in his ears. Who's there? His voice cracked. No answer. The steps stopped beside the bed. He felt the mattress dip, just slightly, as though someone unseen had sat down. Daniel's throat went dry. He didn't dare move. Didn't dare breathe. The silence stretched. Seconds. Minutes. He couldn't tell. And then, soft as a whisper, he felt it. A hand brushing his arm. He lunged for the lamp, slamming the switch. The room exploded in yellow light. Empty. No one was there. The chair in the corner was vacant. The air still. But on the pillow beside him, where no one should have been lying, was a photograph. Not the old one this time. A new one. It showed him, in the motel room, asleep in bed. The timestamp in the corner read, 2:59 a.m. The photograph lay heavy in Daniel's hands. His sleeping form, time-stamped at 2:59 a.m., just minutes before he had woken to footsteps. The implication was unbearable. Someone had been inside his room, standing over him, taking pictures. And he hadn't even stirred. By sunrise, Daniel was already back on the road, exhaustion gnawing at his bones. The diner waitress's note replayed in his mind. You're being watched. Whoever they weren't just watching. They were inside. The stolen files mentioned a location only once, a decommissioned mining site on the outskirts of Ashthorne. Locals called it Quarry Hill, though maps marked it as abandoned decades ago. If Site 13 was anywhere, it had to be there. The further Daniel drove, the worse the roads became. Potholes deep as craters, asphalt cracked like spiderwebs. He parked half a mile away when the path became impassable, continuing on foot with only a flashlight and his camera slung around his neck. The facility revealed itself in pieces. First, the rusted chain-link fence, sagging under the weight of ivy. Then the guard shack, windows smashed, chair inside still turned toward the gate as though someone had only just left. And beyond it, the buildings themselves. Low concrete structures stretched across the valley floor, flat roofs buckling under years of neglect. Some doors hung open like broken jaws. Others were sealed with heavy steel plates, chains thick with rust. A sign half buried in weeds read, "Property of U.S. government. Trespassing strictly forbidden." Daniel stepped over it. Inside, the air was colder. His flashlight cut through dust motes thick as smoke. Hallways stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with heavy metal doors. Many had warning signs stenciled across them. Subject holding authorized personnel, only eyes only. Project files. The deeper Daniel went, the stronger the sense of suffocating silence became. It wasn't the emptiness of an abandoned place. It was a silence that felt maintained, as though someone still enforced it. He reached a large observation room overlooking what might have once been a lab. The glass window was cracked but intact, giving him a view of scattered medical tables, restraints bolted to the floor, and old reels of tape stacked in boxes. Daniel's heart pounded. He set his camera to record, then crept down into the lab. One of the reels still had a label, Subject Test Log. Hands trembling, he threaded it into a dusty player, cranked the handle. The speakers crackled alive. A voice, clinical and detached, begin recording February 14th, 73. Subject exhibits signs of memory displacement. Previous identity suppressed. New identity overwritten. Then another voice, broken, panicked, human. Please, I don't know who I am. I'm not him. Please, let me out. Daniel's stomach twisted. The voice was ragged with terror, but underneath, it was familiar. Unmistakably his own. He staggered back from the player, ball rising in his throat. The reel kept spinning. The voice continued to plead, until suddenly the tape screeched and cut off. Daniel killed the machine, chest heaving. His flashlight flickered, and then he heard it. From somewhere down the corridor, a low, dragging echo of footsteps. Daniel grabbed his backpack and bolted, his own breath deafening in the silence. The hallways twisted, branching into identical intersections, doors all marked with the same warnings. He tried one. It creaked open to reveal rows of empty cots, restraints still fastened. Another opened into a shower room, stained with rust-colored streaks. He pressed on, turning corner after corner. That's when he saw it. At the end of the corridor, bathed in the weak glow of an emergency light, stood a figure. Tall, still, too far to make out clearly, but wrong somehow, its head tilted too far to one side, body held stiff as if straining against invisible wires. Daniel froze. His flashlight trembled in his grip. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there. Then, slowly it raised an arm and pointed directly at him. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He spun and ran, his shoes slapping the concrete, heart pounding in his throat. Corridors blurred past. He didn't dare look back, though every nerve screamed the thing was following. Finally, he ducked into a side room and slammed the door shut behind him, pressing his back against it. The room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of monitors lining the far wall. He froze. The screens were alive. Flickering black and white footage displayed multiple angles of the facility. Hallways, stairwells, labs. Dust and emptiness except, on one screen, a figure moved slowly down a hallway. On another, the same figure turned a corner. On a third, it stood right outside the very door Daniel was hiding behind. His blood iced over. He turned, pressing his ear to the door. Nothing. Silence. And then, 3 sharp knocks rattled the metal. Daniel stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. The monitors flickered violently, static washing over every feed. Then one by one, they blinked off until only a single screen remained. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The screen showed him. Not hallway. Not the lab. Him, inside the monitor room, backpack on his shoulders, eyes wide with terror. The image wasn't a recording. It was live, and behind him, on the monitor, the door was slowly opening. Daniel spun. The room was empty. The door still shut tight. But on the screen, the door was swinging wide, and a shape, dark, contorted, was stepping through. The monitors went black. Daniel stood frozen in the dark, heart hammering. The afterimage of the shadowy figure burned into his mind. He backed away from the door, his breath shallow and ragged. Nothing moved. No sound. Just the endless thrum of silence pressing against his ears. He couldn't stay here. He grabbed his backpack and bolted, retracing his steps through the maze of hallways until the stale air of the outside world finally hit him. He stumbled out into the gray daylight, lungs aching as though he'd been holding his breath for hours. The facility loomed behind him like a grave marker. He didn't look back. By the time Daniel returned to Ashthorne, dusk was settling. The town seemed even emptier than before, though he couldn't tell if that was reality or paranoia gnawing at his edges. Every passing car, every curtain twitching in a window made his skin prickle. He needed answers, something to ground the madness clawing at his brain. Through scraps of overheard conversations and a little coaxing at the gas station, he finally tracked down an address. A man named Harold Crenshaw, once employed as a night guard at the quarry facility. Retired now, living on the edge of town. Daniel drove there before he could second-guess himself. The house was small, the paint curling from weathered wood, the yard overrun with weeds. He knocked. After a long silence, the door opened just enough for a wary eye to peer out. "Mr. Crenshaw?" Daniel asked. The old man studied him. His face was deeply lined, eyes watery but sharp. "Who's asking?" "My name's Daniel. I'm researching the old site. I think you worked there once." The door almost slammed shut, but Daniel wedged his hand against the frame. "Please, I just need to know what it was. What they did there. I saw—" He hesitated, voice shaking. "I heard my own voice on one of the tapes." That made Crenshaw pause. His expression hardened, then softened into something almost like pity. He opened the door wider. "Come in, but you won't like the answers." The inside of the house smelled of mothballs and stale tobacco. Papers and books cluttered every surface. Crenshaw lowered himself into an armchair and gestured for Daniel to sit. "You think they were testing people?" The old man rasped. "No, people were just the tools. What they were testing was reality itself." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" Crenshaw lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The flame illuminated his face in harsh orange light. They wanted to see if identity could be rewritten. Not memories, not conditioning. Identity, who you are at the very core. Imagine copying a man's soul, placing it into another body, erasing the original. Imagine doing it over and over until no one knows what was real anymore. That's what Site 13 was for. Daniel's blood ran cold. And the subjects? Crenshaw exhaled a long plume of smoke. "We were told they volunteered, but they didn't. They screamed. They begged. They tore at their own faces because they didn't recognize the skin they were in." His voice cracked. "Some of them were replaced. Walked out of there wearing their old lives like masks. Families never knew." Daniel's stomach churned. "You mean people out there could be copies?" Crenshaw finished. "Replicas. Echoes. And if you've heard your own voice on those tapes," he leaned forward, eyes glinting, "then maybe you're not the first you either." Daniel's throat tightened. Why didn't anyone shut it down? Expose it? Crenshaw gave a humorless laugh. "You think people wanted the truth? The government buried the site. Paid off the right folks. And the rest of us," he looked away, his hands trembling. "The rest of us stayed quiet. Because once you're marked, once you've heard the voice, you're already part of it." A shiver crawled up Daniel's spine. "What do you mean part of it?" But Crenshaw's eyes weren't on him anymore. They were locked on the mirror hanging on the wall behind Daniel. "Don't move," the old man whispered. Daniel turned, pulse spiking. The mirror reflected him sitting on the couch, pale and shaken. But the reflection wasn't perfect, because in the glass, his mirrored self wasn't still. It was smiling. Daniel scrambled to his feet, knocking over the coffee table. The reflection stared back, grins stretching impossibly wide, while the real Daniel's mouth hung open in horror. "Get out," Crenshaw hissed. "Now!" Before it, the mirror flickered. For a split second, the reflection vanished, then returned, but it wasn't Daniel at all anymore. It was the shadowy figure from the facility, its head still tilted unnaturally, its finger pointing outward. At him, the old man lunged forward, slamming a cloth over the mirror, his voice trembling with fear. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have seen that." Daniel backed toward the door, his heart trying to punch through his ribs. "What is it?" he demanded. Crenshaw shook his head. "Not what? Who?" "That's the one who knows too much. It follows anyone who digs deep enough. It followed me for years. And now it's following you." Daniel's mouth went dry. "How do I stop it?" The old man's eyes brimmed with sorrow. "You don't." Daniel left in a daze. The night air outside felt colder than before, heavy with unseen eyes. Back at his motel, he stood in the bathroom brushing his teeth, staring into the mirror. His mind replayed Crenshaw's words. "Maybe you're not the first you either." He tried to shake it off, leaned closer to spit in the sink. When he straightened, his reflection didn't move with him. For a full, terrible second, it lagged behind, catching up a beat too late. Daniel's blood iced over. And then, slowly, his reflection's lips curled upward into that same impossible smile. Daniel didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he blinked, he saw his reflection smiling back at him in that way no human mouth should. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the bathroom mirror, waiting for it to do it again. It didn't. The reflection was just that, a reflection. Normal, identical, harmless. But the longer he stared, the less certain he became. By morning, the weight of paranoia had grown unbearable. He drove aimlessly, leaving Ashthorne in the rear view, unsure if distance would matter. Crenshaw's words gnawed at him. Maybe you're not the first you either. The thought dug deep. Every memory, every scar, every mundane detail of his life. Were they his, or were they programmed into him? Could he trust a single thing he remembered? He pulled over at a rest stop and scrolled through the stolen documents again. His hands shook as he pieced them together. Most were too redacted to make sense, but one fragment stood out. Identity successfully duplicated. Original subject terminated. Copy retained. Daniel's vision swam. The word terminated burned into his skull. If he was a copy, what had happened to the original? Hours later, exhausted and hollow, Daniel checked into another motel in a different town. He set up his camera on the dresser, pointing it toward the bed. If there's someone else, he whispered into the lens, I'll see it. The idea made his skin crawl, but he needed proof. He needed something real. That night, he forced himself to sleep. The next morning, pale light filtered through the blinds. Daniel sat up groggily, heart pounding as he reached for the camera. He rewound the footage, hit play. At first, it was uneventful, him tossing, turning, the occasional creak of the building. Hours ticked by. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the camera caught movement. A figure entered the frame. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was him, another Daniel. The double crept closer to the bed, eyes glinting in the grainy light. It leaned over the sleeping Daniel, lips moving silently, whispering into his ear. Daniel slammed pause. The image froze on the duplicate's face, identical in every way. He tried to breathe, but his lungs felt constricted. He rewound again, played it slower. This time, he caught the words whispered into his sleeping self's ear. You shouldn't have found this. The camera slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor. A ringing filled his ears, deafening. His chest tightened. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on his face, gripping the sink until his knuckles turned white. He dared to look up into the mirror. His reflection stared back. But it wasn't delayed this time. It wasn't smiling. It was different. Its eyes were colder, its posture more rigid, as if the person looking back wasn't Daniel at all. Who are you? Daniel whispered. The reflection tilted its head. And then, with movements that weren't his own, it raised a finger, pointing straight at him. Daniel staggered back, crashing into the wall. The mirror rippled, just faintly, like water disturbed by a stone. And then, the reflection leaned forward, pressing its palms against the glass from the inside. Daniel's scream caught in his throat as hairline cracks began to spiderweb across the mirror, glass straining against invisible pressure. He bolted out of the bathroom, heart thrashing, shoving his belongings into the backpack. He didn't look back. Couldn't. The motel door slammed shut behind him. He hit the road again, driving with no destination, only the desperate urge to outrun himself. 2 days later, his blog went silent. Readers noticed. They always noticed when Daniel vanished chasing a lead. This time, though, something strange happened. At 3 a.m., a new post appeared. No draft, no explanation, just a single photo. It showed Daniel sitting at his desk, hands on the keyboard, eyes blank. Beneath it, a caption. He found a secret no one wanted you to know. And now, so have you. The post spread quickly. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others swore they recognized the background of the photo. A plain room with peeling wallpaper, the kind found in any forgotten motel across America. But the strangest part wasn't the photo itself. It was the comments that followed. Dozens of readers began claiming they'd seen him. A man who looked exactly like Daniel. Outside their homes, in subway stations, reflected in darkened windows. And every single one described the same thing. The smile. Daniel may have been a copy all along, his original replaced. Open-ended mystery. Was he rewritten, replicated, or is the story itself a contagion spreading through anyone who learns the secret?